The share of U.S. adults who said they don't belong to any religion has grown 7 percentage points in just 7 years. Today I'm going to talk to you about that change, what this trend looks like, what contributes to it, and what does this growing group of Americans look like in terms of their religiosity. But first, before I get into that, let me tell you a little bit about the Pew Research Center if you don't know that much about us. We're a nonpartisan, non-advocacy, non-profit organization. We don't take positions on any political, policy, social, or religious issues for that matter. We also don't do any commercial or market research. We don't have clients. Our mission is to provide good, solid, up-to-date, objective information that policymakers, journalists, religious leaders, and really anyone interested in our work can use to help understand important developments of the day. We're a fairly large organization, and we do research on a lot of different topics, from political polling to demographic research to social trends. We study religious restrictions around the world, and my own specialty is on public opinion related to religion in the U.S. Most of the data I'll show you today come from our religious landscape study. The centerpiece of this study is a large-scale, nationally representative telephone survey of adults 18 and older in the U.S. We interviewed more than 35,000 people in 2007 and repeated much of the same questions again in a survey in 2014 with an additional 35,000 plus respondents. And this gives us the ability to take a really detailed look at religious affiliation in the United States and the ways it's changing or the ways it's stayed the same over the last several years. To start, let's look at the big picture for a second. A majority of U.S. adults, 7 in 10, identify with a Christian faith, but it's a shrinking majority. The Christian share declined by nearly 8 percentage points between 2007 and 2014. Several smaller non-Christian faiths, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, etc., are also represented in the U.S., and as a whole, the share of Americans who identify with a non-Christian faith has ticked up slightly since 2007. But where we really see a lot of growth is in the share of those respondents who tell us in response to a question about religious affiliation that they're atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. And this is the group that is often referred to as the nones. That's N-O-N-E-S, not the other nuns. A shorthand for their lack of religious affiliation. If the unaffiliated are growing, other groups have to be shrinking. You can see here the growth of the unaffiliated that I just referred to. And those 3 red bars are subsets of the Christian share of the population. And you can see that when it comes to the decline in Christianity as a whole, much of this change is occurring among mainline Protestants and Catholics, the Catholic share of the population. Both have declined by roughly 3 percentage points as a share of the population since 2007. The evangelical Protestant share is comparatively more stable, ticking downward by just 1 percentage point in the same time period. Now, generally speaking, the change in the American religious landscape is very broad-based. We've seen a growing share of the nones across most major demographic groups. Both men and women have become less religious affiliated in recent years, college grads and those with less education, across racial and ethnic groups, and in all regions of the country. So there's not really one single group we can point to and say this is where the change is occurring. Rather, it's very broad-based. So what then is behind this trend? What can we point to help us understand what's going on? There's a lot to consider here, but there are a couple things we can point to in our data that help us explain this change. One major factor is generational replacement. Among the silent generation, people who are now in their 70s and 80s, the vast majority, 85%, identify with Christianity. This same is true of over 3/4 of baby boomers and 7 in 10 Gen Xers. But older generations are being replaced by a new generation of young adults that are far less Christian and far more religiously unaffiliated than their parents' and grandparents' generations ever were. Among the youngest millennials, those who were even too young to participate in our 2007 study, fewer than 6 in 10 identify with Christianity, while upwards of 1 in 3 say they have no religion. And I'll say a little bit more about generational change and religiosity in a few minutes. Another important factor to examine when trying to understand what's driving religious change in the U.S. is religious switching. Religious switching is very common in the U.S. Fully 1/3 of adults tell us that they currently identify with a religion different from the one in which they were raised, meaning they've changed their religious affiliation or identity at least once in their lives. And if we include movement within Protestantism, a change from, say, evangelical to mainline, the numbers upwards of 4 in 10 have switched. This chart you're looking at breaks down some important factors for understanding the dynamic behind religious switching and how it contributes to change in the overall religious landscape. The first column shows the share of Americans who are raised in each of these groups. The second, the share who have since left. Then you can see the share who have joined from some other tradition. And finally, the share who currently identify with each group. This approach allows us to look at the ratio of those leaving to joining and what the net effect for each group is. And you can see that the result of religious switching is that the unaffiliated group is the biggest gainer. Only about 9% of Americans were raised unaffiliated, and many of them have become affiliated since then. But many more people were raised in some faith and have since become unaffiliated, 18% of all U.S. adults. And the effect is one of overall growth for this group. Christianity, on the other hand, loses far more people than it gains from religious switching. And this is particularly the case for Catholicism. This chart zooms in on those ratios for leaving to joining and really illustrates this point. There are about 4 people who become unaffiliated for every one who leaves. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are about 6 people who leave Catholicism for every one that joins. The mainline Protestant and historically Black Protestant traditions also lose more than they gain, but the ratio is closer to 2 to 1, and evangelicals actually gain a little bit more than they lose, so the ratio is closer to 1 to 1. So much of the growth of the unaffiliated can be explained by Americans leaving behind the faiths they were raised in, as well as a growing generation that is less affiliated to begin with. This begs the question, is the U.S. becoming less religious? In other words, is religion on the decline, or are we just talking about a change in the way people identify themselves when it comes to a formal affiliation? The first thing to note is that not all of the nuns, again N-O-N-E-S, are entirely non-religious. They aren't all non-believers. Many people use terms like secular or unchurched and the like as synonyms for the nuns, but really that's not entirely accurate. You can start to see that here in this breakdown of this group. If you look just at the 2014 column, about 3 in 10 nuns describe themselves as atheist or agnostic, but the rest, the majority of the nuns, describe themselves as nothing in particular. And among those who say they are nothing in particular when it comes to their religious preference, many of them do say that religion is at least somewhat important to them. Nonetheless, even as I tell you, it's important to note that not all nuns are secular. It's also important to note that as a group, the unaffiliated appear to be growing somewhat less religious as the group grows overall. In 2007, only 1/4 of the unaffiliated were self-described atheists or agnostics, and this group now makes up a larger share of the unaffiliated overall. At the same time, those who say their religion is nothing in particular make up a smaller share of the unaffiliated overall. And this is largely because those who say religion is important to them have declined as a share of the unaffiliateds. You can see here that the religious landscape study also provides evidence of some decline in religion in the U.S. more broadly, beyond changing affiliation and including declines in certain beliefs and practices. There have been modest declines in belief in God, although the vast majority of Americans still believe in God, it's slightly smaller than before. And the share of Americans who say they pray every day, who say religion is very important in their lives, and who say they attend worship services with regularity. But even as we're seeing some overall declines, there's a story of stability behind these numbers as well. If we look just at those Americans who are affiliated with a particular religion, the 3/4 or so of Americans who say they're Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, etc., there's been little to no change on these traditional measures of religiosity. Fully 97% of religiously affiliated U.S. adults say they believe in God or universal spirit, the same share that said this in 2007. 2/3 pray daily and say religion is important in their lives, similar to 2007. And just over 6 in 10 report attending worship services at least monthly. Little change from the first religious landscape study. Sorry, my throat's dry. Now, the unaffiliated, on the other hand, are far less religious by these measures and are becoming even less so. The share who say that religion is not too or not at all important in their lives is growing. The share who say they pray seldom or never is growing. The share who say they often attend religious services is also growing. And the share who say they believe in God or a universal spirit is declining. So it's largely this growing group of nuns who are at the same time growing less religious in many ways that's bringing down the overall figures on measures of religious beliefs and practices. And just as we see with affiliation, there's a generational component behind much of this change as well. Across all these measures, these various religious beliefs, these practices, including religious importance, millennials are less likely to say they believe or practice than their older counterparts, older Americans. Still, as we're seeing religiosity decline in some ways overall, there's also reason to believe that spirituality, at least by some measures, is increasing among U.S. adults. And some have speculated that there's a growing segment of the population that might call themselves spiritual but not religious, who have a more of an individualized approach to their faith in place of organized religion. So is it the case that the unaffiliated are just replacing religion with spirituality in their lives? This answer is something like, not really, no. We find that a growing share of Americans report, for example, that they regularly feel a deep sense of wonder about the universe. And this is true across many subgroups of the population, including both the affiliated and the unaffiliated. Just under half in each group say they feel a deep sense of wonder about the universe at least once a week. And growing shares of Americans also report that they regularly feel a deep sense of spiritual peace and well-being. But here the pattern is a little different. While an increasing share of both the affiliated and the unaffiliated say they feel a deep sense of spiritual peace and well-being at least once a week, a much larger share of the affiliated say this than the unaffiliated, nearly 2/3 compared to with 4 in 10. And the unaffiliated are also more likely than the unaffiliated to say they regularly feel a strong sense of gratitude or thankfulness, and that they often think about the meaning and purpose of life. So while these are just a few ways to try and get at how spirituality might play out in an individual's life, on 3 of the 4, it's the people who are already fairly religious by conventional measures, the affiliated, who also express these aspects of spirituality. And in some previous work of ours, in a 2012 survey, for example, where we focused on the nuns quite a bit, we found that a majority of the nothing in particular crowd said they're not looking for a religion that was right for them, and most of the unaffiliated don't think it's particularly important to belong to a community of people that share your values and beliefs. For those who had been raised in the religion as a child in this study, when asked why they were no longer part of that faith, 7 in 10 said they had just gradually drifted away. There wasn't necessarily some precipitating event, some big aha or oh no moment where they made a conscious decision to leave, just a general slipping away, and not necessarily hostility towards religion so much as indifference. So the nuns as a whole don't seem to be really seeking out some alternative religious or spiritual experiences, nor are they generally outright hostile towards religion. Overall, they express some fairly mixed views about religious institutions. We in fact asked about a series of statements about churches and other religious organizations and whether respondents agreed with each. The first three items here are positive statements, and while the affiliated are generally more likely than the unaffiliated to agree with positive statements, it is still a large majority of the unaffiliated who say churches and other religious organizations bring people together and strengthen community bonds, and that they play an important role in helping the poor and the needy. And more than half say religious institutions protect and strengthen morality in society. But we also asked three negative statements, the bottom three. About 2/3 of the unaffiliated think religious organizations focus too much on rules, are too involved with politics, and are too concerned with money and power. So we have fairly large shares of the unaffiliated expressing both positive and negative views of religious organizations, suggesting some ambivalence among this group when it comes to the role of religion in society. Some of you might be wondering at this point whether the unaffiliated, a comparatively young group of Americans with no religion, with low levels of religiosity, with some ambivalence towards organized religion, might just be a product of a life cycle phenomenon. Maybe young adults lose their connection to organized religion, but come back later in life as they settle down, get married, have kids. In other words, what are the prospects that the unaffiliated will become more religious down the road? As it turns out, this slide is a little weird. That's not good. Well, I'll try and point out the groups to you a little better than this is showing up. The answer is pretty complicated, and it's made more complicated by an unclear slide. There are some ways that people do tend to become more religious as they get older, and prayer is one good example of this. As people get older, they report praying more frequently. You can see a long-term trend from the General Social Survey and shows different generational cohorts over time and how many people within the each cohort say they pray every day. In general, this chart suggests that for each generation, as they've gotten older, they become more likely to report daily prayer. If you look at the baby boomers, for example, the third line here that ends in 64, I believe that you can see, the orangish line, those are the baby boomers. It's a good illustration of this point. Back in the early 1980s, when boomers were in their 20s and 30s, about half of them indicated that they pray every day. As time went by, baby boomers got older. The percentage of them who say they pray daily steadily increased. Today, now that baby boomers are reaching retirement age, nearly 2/3 of them tell us they pray every day. We see the same kind of pattern among Gen Xers, which is the line directly above the boomers. In the late 90s, when Gen X was just reaching adulthood, about 4 in 10 reported praying every day. Now that they're in their 30s and 40s, nearly 6 in 10 Gen Xers say they pray every day. Now, it's hard to say why people become more prayerful as they get older. It could be that people become more prayerful as they begin to think about their own mortality. It could be in response to health challenges. It could be any number of things. But whatever the reason, it's pretty clear that people do tend to become more prayerful as they age. And in that sense, people do tend to become more religious as they get older. This one's better. Well, mostly. The legend's still messed up. But it's not the case that people become more likely to be religiously affiliated as they age. This is the same type of chart you just looked at. It looks at 5 separate generational cohorts, examining the percentage of people who are religious nuns has changed over time. And you can see that the lines in this chart are generally relatively flat. They don't, more or less. Let's focus again on the boomers. Back in the 1970s, when baby boomers were just entering adulthood, 13% said they were religious nuns. Now, if people become more affiliated as they get older, we expect this line to slope downward. If people become more affiliated, then the percentage who are unaffiliated, which is what this chart shows, would decline. But that's not what we see here. Among baby boomers, the line is relatively flat. In recent years, 15% of baby boomers in the General Social Survey describe themselves as religious nuns, close to what we saw in the late 1970s. We see the same thing with Gen Xers and millennials, as well as the greatest and silent generations. So a big part of what's going on here is generational replacement. Young adults are much more likely, much less affiliated than their parents and grandparents currently. And they're also much less affiliated than previous generations of young people have been. So we're talking about when older generations were the same age as millennials are now. And there's no reason to think, assuming that past is precedent, that they'll become religiously affiliated in large numbers as they get older. People do become more religious in some ways as they age and move through the life cycle, but they don't become more religiously affiliated. And in fact, in our data, we've seen growing unaffiliated shares to different degrees, but growing nonetheless across all of these generational cohorts. So if anything, these cohorts are becoming less affiliated over time rather than more affiliated. So that's all I have for you. I saw that I have maybe just under 2 minutes left, so I'm happy to answer what questions you can ask in 2 minutes. Yeah.
Real quickly, I really loved how you compiled this data into a meaningful presentation. My question is, what is your thought on the role of technology in the last 20 years, especially with the internet and increased connectivity and information sharing, on how religiously affiliated people are for some millennials?
You know, actually, I don't really know. We haven't dived into that as a topic of study yet. So that'd be definitely something we could be interesting to explore, but right now we just haven't gone into that. Yeah.
In regards to the data, as like you get into small groups that are just more rare, like the nuns, like the uncertainty, it's a smaller subset of people, so there's more like uncertainty and sort of response. Like if you have a responses, like do you run into any struggles when you're comparing like say a few thousand people or to like there's a 30,000 people survey, so like you have like a small group compared to a big group?
That can be a bigger problem when you do survey research, specifically for the nuns, since they currently make up, 23% of the population, so 23% of 35,000. That sample size is actually incredibly robust. It's when you get into smaller groups. So the reason why we surveyed 35,000 people, both in 2007 and 2014, was so that we could also analyze smaller religious groups. Jews make up 2% of the US population, Muslims make up 1%, Hindus make up 1%, Buddhists make up about 1%. So we sampled a large enough number so that we could talk about a lot of, smaller groups like that you wouldn't necessarily have to worry about for the nuns at this point, but things like that. And basically there's this rule that, not really rule, but as you get more people in your sample, the better able you are to make relationships or find out relationships between them. And we use, margins of error and whatnot. And as you have more people, those margins of error decline. And so differences can become even more pronounced, actually.
So going back to the thing about switching.
Sure.
And last question.
Okay.
Question. Has there been any analysis comparing which group people left to which group they entered? And might there be any surprising relationships?
Sure. So we have this actually, so all the stuff I present to you today is all available on our website. We have 4 or 5 reports related to this study alone on our website, pewresearch.org. So if you just go there, you can find all this stuff. But there's a more detailed table, I believe, in our first report on this that talks about where people started from in terms of their religious faith and now where they're at. I don't remember the specifics of it, but a lot of that switching is into becoming unaffiliated. That's where a lot of it's moving from. And the earlier slide I showed you about the groups that are declining in the share of the overall population, Catholics, mainly Protestants, whatnot, some of that's going into the unaffiliated. But we also, I believe, can't quote me on this, but I think we have a table that also looks at specific Protestant groups, such as Baptists, can't think of any other groups, but there's tons of them, I'm sorry, that might show where they change. I believe we have something like that in there as well.